The Nebulon Citadel floated regally in the vast embrace of space, an architectural marvel crafted from the luminous fragments of shattered stars and the rare minerals mined from the depths of dying suns. Its structure gleamed in hues of silver and violet, pulsating with an ancient energy that resonated across the void. For eons it had served as the meeting place for the most pivotal summits, and now it was poised to host an event that would either cement peace or unravel the fabric of the galaxy. Delegates from every corner of the known universe thronged the halls of the Citadel, their appearances as diverse as the planets they represented. The air thrummed with anticipation and tension, charged by the whispered conversations of beings whose lifespan spanned millennia and those whose fleeting lives passed in the blink of an eye. Today, all eyes were on two queens, each a force unto herself, and the unlikely figure who stood at the center of their competition, a human diplomat from a small blue planet, orbiting an average star in the Orion Arm. The polished floors of the grand atrium reflected the intricate glow of holographic banners, each depicting scenes of peace treaties etched into galactic history. Robotic servants glided smoothly, their limbs shifting and whirring as they distributed drinks composed of exotic liquids from distant worlds, each more vibrant than the last. All awaited the arrival of Queen Laris of the Golden Dominion and Queen Maharis of the Dark Nebula. The first to arrive was Queen Laris. The announcement of her entrance was accompanied by a golden, resonant chime that seemed to fill not just the air but the mind, compelling all present to pause and behold her arrival. The Queen's ship, the Aurelian, approached the docking bay in a blaze of light, haloed by rings of luminescent energy that shifted like liquid gold. When the doors of the vessel parted, Laris stepped out, her presence illuminating the room like a sun. Her gown was woven from golden threads that shimmered with an otherworldly glow, each movement casting sparks that seemed to dance in the air. A crown of interlocking star-shaped jewels sat regally atop her head, enhancing the majesty of her features. Her entourage, an assembly of advisors and guards clad in the polished armor of the Golden Dominion, followed in disciplined formation. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, expressions of awe and a touch of envy. For in Laris's eyes they saw the power of a queen who had bent empires to her will, who commanded not just respect but devotion. With a single, sweeping glance that took in the gathering, Laris inclined her head gracefully, acknowledging the diplomat who stood on a raised dais at the center of the atrium. He was unassuming by comparison, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an expression that betrayed neither fear nor awe, only the practiced neutrality of a seasoned negotiator. Though he was human, a race often considered young and inexperienced by galactic standards, there was something in his bearing that suggested an old soul. The grand entrance had barely settled into silence when the light in the room seemed to shift, dimming into a soft, starlit hue. A pulse of low, melodic music swept through the space, resonant and darkly beautiful. The air itself seemed to shimmer with anticipation as the Ebon Celestia, Queen Maharis's ship, appeared outside the translucent walls of the docking bay, moving with a predatory grace. Unlike the warm, resplendent glow of Laris's arrival, the Ebon Celestia was draped in an obsidian aura, speckled with twinkling motes of light that resembled a piece of the night sky brought to life. When the doors of the ship opened, Queen Maharis emerged, her steps as fluid as flowing water. Her dark hair cascaded down her back, a waterfall of starlit black that caught glimmers of silver with each movement. Her gown, made of a fabric that appeared to absorb light, contrasted starkly with the faint, celestial glimmers embedded within. Her gaze was fierce and commanding, yet beneath it lay an almost imperceptible softness that only the most observant would notice. The stories of her prowess in battle and her relentless pursuit of victory were well known, but today she was not here as a conqueror, she was here as a seeker of peace. The diplomat's heartbeat quickened as Maharis's eyes met his, and he could have sworn there was an unspoken understanding that passed between them, a silent recognition of the burden they each carried. She approached the dais, her presence magnetic, the subtle perfume of night-blooming flowers trailing in her wake. With both queens present, the atrium seemed to hold its breath. The air was heavy with a kind of electricity that came not from any mechanical source, but from the gravity of the moment. The diplomat stepped forward, clearing his throat. The eyes of beings who had seen the birth and death of stars were on him, waiting. "Your Majesties," he began, his voice steady, "today marks the beginning of an opportunity unprecedented in our shared history. It is not just a gathering of power, but a convergence of intent, an invitation to shape the destiny of the galaxy together." Queen Laris smiled, a slow, calculated curve of her lips. Indeed, she said, her voice like molten gold, deep and resonant. And as a testament to this unity, I offer a monument to peace, carved from the most precious elements of my realm. It shall orbit your home, Earth, a symbol of our pact. A murmur of approval swept through the assembly. The sheer grandeur of Lyris's gift was undeniable, as was her strategic acumen in positioning herself as the protector of peace. Queen Maharis's expression remained unreadable. When the murmurs subsided, she spoke, her voice low but sharp, cutting through the tension like a comet through the dark. Peace is not built on monuments alone, nor on treasures. It is built on understanding. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. And so I invite you all to witness a night of music and memory, an ode to the shared stories that bind us, presented to you, Diplomat, as a reflection of your world and the dreams it holds. The contrast between their approaches was stark, and the Diplomat felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the full implications of their rivalry. It was not just about winning his favor, it was about embodying two paths for the future, one paved with strength and legacy, the other with empathy and resonance. As the light of distant galaxies twinkled through the high, arched windows, the assembly was left contemplating not only the brilliance of these two queens but the path their decision would carve for the galaxy. The burden of choice weighed heavily on the human Diplomat, a figure small in stature compared to the cosmic powers that surrounded him, yet mighty in the balance he would tip. For tonight was only the beginning. The galaxy watched, waited, and wondered which queen would seize not just the heart of the human, but the destiny of countless star systems. The golden glow of Queen Lyris's promise had barely faded when the diplomatic quarters of the Nebulon Citadel buzzed with whispered conversations and veiled intentions. The halls were alive with anticipation, the tension thick as the ethereal mists that coiled through the corridors like silent sentinels. Delegates moved in clusters, their garments reflecting their homeworld's silver suits shimmering like liquid mercury, flowing robes woven with fibers of nebulous silk, and scaled armor that shifted colors like a chameleon's skin. The human Diplomat, Thomas Elric, stood alone on a balcony overlooking the swirling patterns of the Andromeda Nebula. It was a view he often sought when the weight of his role pressed too heavily on his mind. The stars, infinite and indifferent, reminded him of Earth's night skies and brought a semblance of calm. Yet today the peace was elusive. His thoughts churned like the maelstrom of celestial gas before him. Thomas Elric, the voice behind him, was soft, golden, and unmistakably commanding. He turned to see Queen Lyris, resplendent in her golden attire, the shifting light of the nebula casting flickers of molten gold across her face. She moved with the poise of someone who knew the world bent to her will, her eyes sharp with an intelligence that seemed to pierce through any pretense. "Your Majesty," he replied, dipping his head in respect. Lyris's presence was formidable up close, her aura pulsating with a subtle power that raised the fine hairs on his arms. "Do you like it?" she asked, gesturing to the view. "It's breathtaking," Thomas admitted, his voice tinged with honest admiration. "It's easy to forget how vast the universe is when we're so focused on the politics within it." Lyris nodded, stepping closer so that their shadows mingled in the starlight. "And that is why we must shape it, must we not? Only by seizing control can we protect what is precious." Her voice dipped, taking on an intimate tone as she spoke. "Earth may seem small, Thomas, but it is unique, and it has produced you a diplomat who has held peace in balance with nothing more than words and will." Thomas felt a flush of heat at the compliment, though he kept his expression neutral. Lyris continued, her eyes gleaming. "I offer you more than monuments. I offer you a partnership. Imagine Earth as the linchpin of a new age, one where its voice carries not as a mere participant but as an equal among giants." "And at what cost?" he asked, a note of steel entering his tone. The Queen's smile widened, sensing his probing spirit. "Only the cost of trust," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Accept my proposal, and I will commission the creation of the eternal beacon, a monument of peace that orbits Earth, casting its golden light across the stars. Let that be the symbol of our unity." For a moment Thomas could almost see it, the glittering tower of cosmic gold floating above his home, a beacon of hope or a harbinger of alliances that would bind Earth to a queen who wielded her power like a blade. He nodded, more as an acknowledgement than agreement, and Lyris took the gesture for what it was, a seed of consideration. With a graceful turn, she left, her footsteps echoing softly in the corridor, leaving behind the scent of something metallic and floral. The announcement of Queen Maharis's musical ceremony came soon after, and the citadel thrummed with curiosity. Thomas, intrigued and wary, entered the grand performance hall that evening. The space was transformed. Long strands of dark silk draped the walls, interspersed with clusters of glowing orbs that floated as if suspended in zero gravity. The atmosphere was intimate, yet it stretched infinitely, a paradox that seemed fitting for the queen who ruled the dark nebula. The audience was a blend of beings, some with iridescent scales, others with translucent skin through which one could see their pulsing hearts. All had gathered in silence, waiting. A lone figure stepped into the center of the room, and every eye turned to Queen Maharis. Dressed in a gown that rippled like the surface of a dark sea, dotted with tiny lights that mimicked the constellations, she appeared both ethereal and commanding. Thomas's breath caught as their eyes met. Where Laris had been all calculated grandeur, Maharis embodied something raw, almost tender, yet undeniably powerful. "My friends," Maharis began, her voice a melody that resonated in the bones, "we are here not for speeches or pledges, but to share a story woven from memory, light, and sound." She raised a slender hand, and the room darkened until only the floating orbs cast a gentle glow. A subtle, thrumming note began to build, vibrating through the floor and up through Thomas's body. The sound was deep, resonant, and it conjured a vision in his mind, a star being born, its light a beacon of hope in a canvas of black. The music shifted, layering harmonious tones with a soft, rhythmic pulse. Images began to appear within the orb's memories, not from any ancient tale but from Earth. He saw rolling fields of golden wheat, children laughing as they chased each other under the sun, the solemn grandeur of an ocean at dawn. Thomas felt his throat tighten. These were not just generic scenes, they were memories, snippets of life from Earth itself. And then, as the music took on a melancholic chord, he saw the history of struggle, towering smoke from factories that belched pollution into the sky, cities glowing with artificial light that dimmed the stars, and moments of conflict where shadows clashed against flickers of resistance. The final image was one of hope, a group of people, diverse and weary, looking up at the sky, yearning for a better tomorrow. The room was silent, save for the soft thrum of the music. Maharis's voice broke the quiet, a whisper that seemed to caress every ear. "Peace is not just built, it is felt, shared, lived. Let this be our song." Thomas blinked, fighting the sting of emotion that welled in his eyes. It wasn't just the beauty of the display that moved him, but the message, one that spoke directly to the heart, bypassing political maneuvering and strategic foresight. He could see how Maharis sought not just an alliance but an understanding, a unity that was more personal, more visceral. As the final note faded and the orbs dimmed, Thomas could feel the tension that had bound the room dissipate, replaced by a collective, silent introspection. The queen stood still, her gaze fixed on him, awaiting the unspoken judgment. The crowd erupted into murmurs, some moved, others whispering their concerns. To them, it might have been seen as an act of manipulation, a show of emotional strength to rival Laris's strategic offer. But Thomas knew better. He could sense the sincerity embedded in Maharis's display. The queens had laid out their first moves, each distinct yet equally compelling. The choice before him was not simply about which queen to favor, it was about which vision to champion for the galaxy's future. As he left the hall, the weight on his shoulders felt heavier than ever. The echoes of music and memory chased him down the corridor, intertwining with the whisper of Laris's earlier words. It was not just a choice for him, he realized. It was a decision that would alter the trajectory of countless star systems, binding them to either the glittering strength of a monumental legacy or the heartfelt symphony of shared understanding. The Nebulon citadel hummed with an electric anticipation that pulsed through its crystalline walls, reverberating through the atrium where hundreds had gathered. Delegates adorned in garb that sparkled like constellations stood shoulder to shoulder with warriors whose armor seemed forged from stardust itself. The grandeur of the peace summit had taken on a new tension, one that no blade or proclamation could cut. Whispers spread like wildfire, crossing language barriers and technological interpretations as easily as sunlight passing through a morning mist. Thomas Elric stood at the heart of it all, caught in the tumult of murmurs and curious glances. The human diplomat's posture was upright, shoulders squared, yet beneath that calm exterior, a tempest brewed. He could still feel the resonance of Queen Maharis's music from the previous night, the memory of it twisting through his mind like ivy around a stone tower. It had been haunting, raw, and profoundly personal, a reminder of Earth's struggles and the unyielding will to dream of better days. But now was the moment when Queen Maharis would deliver her poem. The announcement had spread like a solar flare throughout the citadel. The warrior queen, whose beauty and ferocity were legendary, would recite an ode inspired by Thomas himself. The prospect was tantalizing, daring to breach the very boundaries of diplomacy, moving beyond calculated gestures into the realm of deeply felt expressions. The hall darkened, leaving only a soft luminescence emanating from the arches of stardust and light orbs scattered along the perimeter. A hush fell over the crowd, the collective breath held as Queen Maharis entered, her presence casting a spell of silence that swept across the chamber. Dressed in deep midnight fabric, the queen seemed sculpted from the cosmos. Her gown was a tapestry of shimmering black, scattered with star-like gems that glimmered with every move, as if constellations themselves had gathered to pay tribute. Her eyes, twin pools of infinite darkness, held Thomas's gaze as she walked to the center stage, a circular platform that seemed to float above a sea of mirrored glass. "My friends," she began, and her voice was a song of gravity and stars, drawing all ears and hearts into its orbit. "We come here to build peace, not just with treaties, but with understanding. And so tonight I offer you not riches, not promises wrought from stone and steel, but words a mirror to our shared existence." The crowd was transfixed, their attention drawn as if by an unseen force. Thomas swallowed hard, feeling exposed, as though the queen's words reached not just his ears but something deeper, something he had thought safeguarded behind the iron gates of his mind. The queen closed her eyes, inhaling as if drawing strength from the very fabric of space. When she opened them again, they seemed to glow softly, starlit and wet with unspoken sentiment. She raised her hands, palms open, as if cradling the air, and began to speak. "Once I heard a tale told by fire, of a world woven from struggle and song. Its people, small beneath an endless sky, gazed up, not with fear but defiance, yearning for stars that whispered of promise, where light meets shadow and dreams belong." A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle yet palpable, as if the room collectively shivered. Thomas's chest tightened with recognition. The poem spoke of Earth, of its fragile beauty and relentless pursuit of hope, even when hope seemed a cruel jest. He glanced around and saw the faces of beings from distant worlds glowing, scaled and multi-eyed, now reflecting the same solemnity that weighed on his own heart. Maharis's voice grew stronger, more impassioned. "But dreams are forged in the furnace of doubt, shaped by hands worn and hearts mended. To rise from ash, to hold the fire, to carry it forward though winds conspire, is to know peace not as the absence of battle, but as the victory of light over silence." Thomas's vision blurred at the edges as emotions long buried stirred awake. He was no longer standing in the citadel but in the memory of his youth, seeing his mother light a single candle during a blackout, its tiny flame reflected in the tears that tracked her soot-streaked face. He blinked, dragging himself back to the present, where Maharis's poem continued to unfold like a ribbon unspooled across galaxies. "Tonight we stand at the crossroads of fate, with the weight of stars upon our backs. But let us not tread paths alone. For peace is more than one voice or one realm. It is a chorus, a harmony of struggles shared, bound by the hope that none must stand apart." The final words hung in the air, a symphony of silence that resonated louder than any applause. Queen Maharis stood unmoving, her head inclined slightly, awaiting the judgment of her audience. For a breathless moment, the only sound was the collective heartbeat of the room. Then, like a wave cresting and crashing, the applause began, tentative at first, then building into a roar that echoed through the halls of the citadel. Some clapped with measured politeness, others with genuine fervor. Thomas found himself swept up in the current, the ache in his chest not unpleasant but sharp and poignant, like the aftershock of a cathartic cry. He glanced at Queen Lyris, who stood apart, her golden aura still shimmering with a defiant glow. Her expression was calm, calculated, but a flicker of something deeper flashed in her eyes. Thomas recognized it as acknowledgement, and perhaps a touch of unease. The battlefield of diplomacy had taken a turn she had not anticipated. As the applause subsided, Queen Maharis bowed gracefully, her gaze finally meeting Thomas's with an intensity that seemed to say, "Understand, this was for you, and for what you carry." The attendees began to disperse, the air now filled with renewed whispers. But Thomas remained rooted, his mind whirling with the implications of what had just transpired. This was no mere political maneuver, it was a declaration that transcended power plays and promises. It was a plea for unity, built not on strategy or ambition, but on shared humanity or shared being, whatever form it took across the galaxy. An aide touched his arm, startling him from his reverie. "Sir, the Queens await your response," they whispered, eyes wide with the awareness of what hung in the balance. Thomas nodded, the gravity of the moment anchoring him. His decision would not only shift the dynamics between two powerful queens but would shape the future alliances of star systems, affecting beings light years apart. He took a deep breath, the echo of Maharis's poem reverberating within him, steadying the path he knew he must walk. And as he turned to leave the hall, the stars outside the citadel seemed to shimmer a little brighter, as if urging him on with silent encouragement. Thomas Elric strode down the corridor of the Nebulon Citadel, his steps echoing in the polished silence. The halls, once buzzing with the murmur of delegates and advisors, now seemed hollow, their mirrored surfaces catching fragments of his expression, concern, resolve, and a trace of something that looked like doubt. He passed towering windows that offered breathtaking views of the sprawling cosmos, each star a reminder of the enormity of his task. This was no longer just a diplomatic mission, it was a choice that could alter the balance of power in the galaxy, and everyone knew it. Rumors of an ancient prophecy had begun to circulate among the attending delegates. Whispers slipped through the air like ghosts, flitting from ear to ear. The prophecy spoke of a time when a decision made by an unlikely representative, a figure perceived as minor on the galactic stage, would forge a path that could lead either to an age of enlightenment or to an era shadowed by conflict. Thomas had dismissed such stories at first, relegating them to the realm of myth and superstition. But as the summit wore on, and as he saw how the Queen's rivalry intensified, the weight of those whispers pressed down on him like a physical force. The diplomat's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden appearance of a shadow moving along the wall, a silhouette that solidified into Queen Maharis herself. Her arrival was as silent as space, her expression unreadable yet charged with purpose. Her gown shifted with her movements, the fabric rippling like the surface of a midnight sea, scattering tiny starlit reflections across the corridor. "Thomas," she said, her voice low and edged with urgency. It was the first time she had addressed him outside the formalities of the summit, and the sound of her speaking his name stirred something in him, an ember of anticipation, a flicker of trust. "Your Majesty," he replied, inclining his head. But before he could say more, she gestured for silence and looked over her shoulder, as if expecting shadows to listen. "Walk with me," she commanded, though her voice held a hint of plea. Without waiting for his reply, she turned and moved down the corridor. Thomas fell into step beside her, matching her stride. The silence between them was heavy, like the pause before a storm. They reached a secluded observation deck, its glass panels arching into a dome that revealed the great, yawning expanse of the universe. Stars flickered like diamonds on a velvet sheet, and the faint glow of a distant supernova painted a slash of color across the black. Here, in this vastness, their smallness was undeniable. Maharis turned to him, her eyes glistening in the starlight. "Don't you?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas hesitated, the question coiling around his thoughts. He wasn't sure how much he knew or what he wanted to admit. "If you're asking whether I've heard the rumors about the prophecy, then yes," he said, his tone steady, almost defiant. A small, bittersweet smile curved Maharis's lips. "It is more than a rumor, Thomas. The prophecy is real. It's written in the ancient star scripts, recorded in places where light itself fears to tread. And it speaks of a decision, a choice made by one whose heart holds the balance." He opened his mouth to speak, but the weight of her words stilled him. The implications swirled through his mind, linking the threads of what he'd seen and felt since he arrived. The gestures, the challenges, the profound appeals from both queens, everything began to take on new meaning, as if pieces of an unseen puzzle were sliding into place. "Why are you telling me this now?" he finally asked, his voice tight. "Because," she said, taking a step closer, "the choice is not between power and poetry, between stone monuments and starlit songs. It is about what kind of peace you wish to forge, a peace that binds through command, or one that binds through shared spirit. Lyris believes peace is carved and shaped, something won and maintained with vigilance. I know it must be nurtured, something that breathes and grows." Her eyes searched his face for understanding. In them, Thomas saw something that both moved and unsettled him: vulnerability. This was not the formidable warrior queen, whose tales of victory inspired legends. This was Maharis, a leader who laid her hopes bare before him, trusting that he would see her truth. "I don't know what I believe anymore," he admitted. "Each of you speaks to a different part of me." A moment of silence stretched between them before she nodded. "And that is why the prophecy spoke of you, Thomas, because only you can hold those contradictions and find a way forward." Before he could respond, a sharp chime rang out, its sound like the clash of metal, breaking the fragile intimacy of the moment. A figure appeared in the entrance to the observation deck, adorned in golden robes that shimmered as if spun from light itself. Queen Lyris, her presence radiant and commanding, strode forward, the regal set of her shoulders daring anyone to question her right to be there. "Ah, Thomas," she said smoothly, eyes flicking between him and Maharis. "I wondered where you had disappeared." There was an edge to her voice, an unspoken challenge that lanced through the air like a bolt of electricity. Maharis's eyes hardened, but she said nothing. Thomas's pulse quickened. He was caught between two forces that seemed to crackle with an invisible energy, like opposing stars on the brink of collision. Lyris's gaze locked onto him, the golden glint in her eyes unwavering. "I trust you have taken my words to heart. The monument I spoke of is already underway. It will be a beacon, a testament to what we can achieve together." Her voice was measured, her poise immaculate. Yet behind the polished veneer, Thomas detected a sliver of uncertainty. She, too, was aware of the stakes. Maharis's chin lifted slightly, defiance in the arch of her brow. "A beacon is only as strong as the light it carries, Lyris," she said, her voice cool, "and light does not compel, it draws." The tension between them was palpable, a silent storm brewing within the confines of the observation deck. Thomas felt the urge to step back, to let them argue their cases alone, but he knew this was his moment. The moment that countless star systems would look back on as the turning point. "Enough," he said, his voice firmer than he expected. The queens turned to him, two queens of unimaginable power, their eyes holding centuries of rivalry, hope, and ambition. "I understand what you both offer and what it means for the galaxy. But understand, this peace is not yours to give. It is ours to make together." His words echoed in the stillness, resonating with the enormity of truth. A flicker of surprise crossed Lyris's face, softening the sharp angles of her expression, while Maharis's gaze held a glimmer of hope. Before any further words could be exchanged, the lights in the room flickered and dimmed. A low rumble began, resonating through the floors, vibrating up through their feet. An alarm blared, shrill and urgent, cutting through the tension like a blade. The citadel shuddered, and a voice crackled through the comm systems, the tone sharp with panic. "Alert. Unknown vessel approaching. All delegates to their secure zones immediately." Chaos erupted. Thomas's eyes widened, a surge of dread cutting through him as he realized what this meant. The summit, this delicate tapestry of diplomacy and hope, was under threat, and with it, the fragile choice that balanced on the edge of the human diplomat's hands might crumble into stardust. Maharis's hand found his arm, a brief, grounding touch. "We must go," she said, her voice urgent but steady. Lyris nodded, her expression grim but resolute. "This isn't over," she said to Thomas, not as a warning but as a promise. As the two queens and the human diplomat moved toward the exits, the citadel shuddered again, and for the first time, Thomas truly understood the weight of the prophecy. The battle for peace had never been about what was already written. It was about what they were willing to write together, in the uncertain ink of choice and courage. The citadel was chaos. Lights flickered, casting the halls in sharp relief before plunging them into darkness again, only to flare back to life in sputtering bursts. The low rumble of the unknown vessel's approach reverberated through the floors, shaking the ancient metal bones of the Nebulon citadel and sending a shockwave of fear through all who stood within. Thomas Elric felt each vibration in his chest, a cold, steady drumbeat that matched the racing of his heart. "Stay close," Queen Maharis's voice cut through the confusion, commanding yet urgent. She moved with the grace of a warrior, dark gown rippling like storm-tossed water as she led him through the labyrinthine corridors. Thomas followed, conscious of the dozens of beings rushing past them, delegates, guards and advisors, each moving with panicked intent. To his right, Queen Lyris kept pace, her golden aura flickering like a shield. She radiated calm authority, her eyes sharp and assessing as she shouted orders to her own guards. The contrast between the two queens was stark. Maharis was a force of fierce energy, her intensity almost palpable, while Lyris exuded an unyielding, imperious confidence that held her followers in thrall. "We need to reach the central chamber," Lyris called over her shoulder. Her voice cut through the cacophony like a clarion, and her guards responded with immediate precision, forming a protective formation around them. "Agreed," Maharis snapped, sparing only a brief glance at her rival. "But it's not just shelter we need. We must prepare for what comes next." Thomas's mind raced. The prophecy whispered through his thoughts like a specter, its words woven with doubt and destiny. Was this the test it spoke of? A choice made under duress, where all paths would lead to irrevocable consequences. The diplomat swallowed hard and forced his focus outward. There would be time to ponder later if they survived. The central chamber loomed ahead, its doors already pried open by a team of guards. They rushed inside, the room dimly lit by emergency lights that bathed everything in crimson. The chamber was built for war councils, with a massive, curved table surrounded by holographic displays that now flickered erratically. The space was vast, the ceiling a dome of glass that showcased the swirling beauty of the cosmos, a stark contrast to the battle erupting in its shadow. Thomas stepped forward, scanning the room as delegates flooded in behind them, their voices a mixture of panic and urgency. The echo of heavy boots on metal rang out as more guards secured the perimeter, their faces set in grim determination. "Report," Lyris commanded, turning to one of her advisors, a tall figure with skin like polished bronze and eyes that blinked vertically. The advisor inclined their head, eyes flaring as they transmitted a stream of data into the holographic console. A moment later, a ghostly projection of the attacking vessel appeared. It was jagged, a monstrous silhouette that bristled with weapons and radiated an eerie, blue light. It was a ship Thomas didn't recognize, an outsider to the known alliances, a rogue force bent on disruption. An unidentified warship, heavily armed. "It bypassed our initial defenses," the advisor reported, their voice mechanical, betraying no emotion. A murmur of fear passed through the assembled delegates. Lyris's expression darkened, her jaw tightening. "We need to neutralize it before it breaches the outer defenses of the Citadel," she said, her voice edged with urgency. No, Maharis interjected, stepping into the center of the chamber. "This isn't just an attack. Look at it," she pointed to the holographic ship. "Its markings are scattered, ancient. It's no mere warship. It's a relic of the first expansion wars, a harbinger of disruption, yes, but also a message." A message. Lyris's eyes narrowed, skepticism seeping into her voice. Thomas watched them, tension tightening his chest. He understood what Maharis was hinting at. This was more than an opportunistic strike. It was a signal of violent declaration that whoever commanded this vessel intended to undermine the fragile unity that this summit represented. "Your Majesties," Thomas said, stepping forward, the weight of his role settling heavily on his shoulders. The room quieted, all eyes turning to him. "We have two choices. We can fight, deploying every ship and weapon in our reach to destroy this threat and reinforce the narrative that peace is only possible through overwhelming force." He paused, letting the implication settle before continuing, his voice firmer. "Or we can use this moment to demonstrate that peace can withstand even the most unexpected challenges. We reach out to them, try to understand their purpose and intent before striking." A heavy silence followed. The dichotomy was stark, aligning perfectly with the Queen's philosophies. Lyris's expression hardened, a brief flash of pride in her eyes. "And if this is a ruse, Thomas, if this moment of hesitation costs us the Citadel and the lives within it?" Thomas's jaw clenched. "Then we fight only when we must, and not before." Maharis nodded, the starlit glow in her eyes softening. "A true test of peace is not how we react in the face of agreements and promises, but how we respond to threats. We must show that our unity is more than just words on a star-scribed page." The tension in the room crackled like static. Delegates exchanged nervous glances, torn between the two queens and the human diplomat who stood at the crux of their decision. "Send a transmission," Thomas said, turning to the comms officer. "Let them know we see them, and we're willing to talk." The officer hesitated, fingers hovering over the controls. A look from Lyris, cold, assessing, finally convinced them to act. A moment later, the holographic console displayed the transmission being sent. a beacon of light extending into the dark expanse where the mysterious worship loomed. The response was almost immediate. A voice, deep and metallic, echoed through the chamber, bouncing off the walls with an alien cadence. "You recognize us, then? The descendants of those forgotten by your treaties, by your promises of peace that left the fringe worlds to starve and scatter." Thomas exchanged a glance with Maharis, a thread of realization tightening between them. This wasn't an outsider, it was a remnant of history, a wound reopened in the shadow of their summit. "This is our opportunity," Maharis said quietly, so only Thomas and Laris could hear. "If we can bridge this moment, we show that peace isn't just between two empires, but for all." Laris's lips pressed into a thin line, the muscles in her jaw working. Finally she nodded. "Extend our words, Thomas. Make this count." He stepped forward, the gaze of every being in the room pressing on him like gravity. "We hear you," he said, his voice clear and steady, "and we are willing to listen. Let us not repeat the mistakes of the past. If there is a way forward, we must find it together." A beat passed that felt like a millennium. The voice on the other end was silent, the silence itself as sharp as any blade. Then, a different kind of rumble reverberated through the citadel, not the shudder of weaponry, but a low, resonant pulse. The image of the warship shifted, its weapons dimming, the blue light transforming into a softer, pulsing glow. "You speak of understanding," the voice finally replied, the metallic edge less harsh. "Then we will see if your unity holds true." A collective exhale rippled through the chamber. Thomas felt his knees weaken, a tremor passing through him that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the fragile hope that coursed like fire through his veins. Laris looked at him, a spark of something like respect in her eyes, while Maharis's lips quirked into a brief, knowing smile. The room buzzed with cautious optimism as the weight of choice settled around them, not as a burden but as a shared promise. Outside, the stars watched, their silent light unwavering as the citadel, bruised but not broken, became a beacon of a new chapter, one shaped, not just by power or poetry, but by the unexpected strength found in the spaces between them. The early moments after the ceasefire were a blur of motion and subdued relief. The lights of the Nebulon citadel returned to their soft, silver glow, casting dancing shadows across the now silent chamber. Delegates and guards alike exhaled tension in waves, their postures relaxing as the realization of survival sunk in. Thomas Elric stood at the center, surrounded by a sea of eyes, some cautious, others glimmering with hope. His pulse thudded in his ears, and he felt the weight of the decision he had just made settle around him like a mantle. Laris was the first to break the silence, her eyes sharp with appraisal. She took a step forward, her golden gown whispering against the polished floor. "A calculated risk, Thomas," she said, her tone devoid of malice but tinged with the echo of command. "But a necessary one. Your choice has changed the narrative of this summit." Thomas met her gaze, searching for any hint of hidden resentment. Instead, he found something unexpected: respect. The hard lines of her mouth softened ever so slightly, a queen recognizing the gamble that could have led to ruin, but instead pointed to possibility. "I did what I believed was right," he replied, his voice steady but low, a tone meant only for the two queens who now stood before him. Maharis joined them, her eyes luminous with restrained emotion, the dark glow around her seeming to pulse in time with her heartbeat. "And you were right," Maharis said, her voice carrying a warmth that contrasted with Laris's coolness. "There is power in showing restraint, in letting dialogue bridge the spaces that weapons cannot." The air was still brittle with the aftershocks of conflict, but it no longer felt like a place poised on the brink of battle. The holographic displays around the room continued to show the outline of the mysterious warship, now drifting in a holding pattern just outside the citadel's perimeter. The once threatening glow of its weaponry had dimmed to a subdued shimmer, a tentative truce that flickered like a fragile star. Comms Officer Thomas called, breaking away from the queens and stepping to the main console, where the officer hovered with wide, uncertain eyes. "Send a secure transmission back to the vessel. Let them know we will be convening a small delegation to discuss their grievances and what reparations might be made." The officer nodded, fingers already dancing over the controls as they sent the message out into the cold void. Thomas's chest tightened with the knowledge that this was just the beginning. The summit had been a stage for dialogue between two great queens, but now it had become the epicenter of a potential alliance far beyond what he or anyone else had anticipated. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the room was filled with the murmurs of subdued conversation. Delegates whispered to each other, exchanging glances that spoke of surprise, disbelief, and above all, a cautious hope. The ancient prophecy whispered about in shadowed corners now took on a new meaning. Perhaps it was never about choosing between the two queens alone, but about navigating the greater currents of fate that swept through the galaxy. The first response from the warship came through, its voice no longer a cold, metallic snarl but a resonant tone edged with weariness. "We accept your offer to speak, under the condition that we are heard not as relics, but as rightful inheritors of the promises once made." Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He exchanged a look with Lyris and Maharis, each queen dipping their heads in a silent agreement. This was their moment to solidify a peace that reached deeper than the rivalry that had once defined them. "Arrange a secure room for the discussions," Lyris said, turning to one of her attendants. "And prepare our guards. Trust is fragile. We must protect this opportunity as fiercely as we would any battle." The attendant nodded and departed swiftly, leaving a silence that was soon broken by Maharis. "We will show them the galaxy can be different than what they remember. That peace can be real, sustained not by the dominance of one, but by the voices of many." Thomas felt the last pieces of tension uncoil from his muscles. For the first time since he had arrived at the Citadel, he felt not like an observer or a pawn in a game played by queens, but like a participant who held the power to shape outcomes. He watched as Lyris and Maharis exchanged a look, not the cold, measuring glances of adversaries, but a shared understanding that hinted at something deeper, an acknowledgement of the paths they had each taken to reach this moment. The small conference room where the negotiations were to take place was a stark contrast to the grand chambers and the sweeping halls of the Citadel. Its walls were simple, adorned with light panels that glowed with a soft, ambient light. A long, metallic table dominated the center of the room, its surface polished enough to reflect the faces of those who gathered around it. Representatives from the warship arrived first, entering with slow, deliberate movements. They were a mix of beings tall and sinewy, with skin marked by deep, iridescent patterns that pulsed like the roots of a glowing tree. Their eyes were sharp, taking in the room and its occupants with a guarded wariness. Their leader, a being with dark, horn-like protrusions that curved back from his temples, stepped forward. His voice was resonant but low, like distant thunder. "We have been forgotten," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Cast out into the void after your treaties spoke of peace only for the core worlds." A ripple of tension went through the room, but Thomas raised his hand for silence. He leaned forward, meeting the gaze of the ship's leader. "You have not been forgotten," he said, each word chosen with care. "But you have been unseen, unheard. Today that changes." The room held its collective breath as the silence thickened, charged with the gravity of unspoken words. Then, slowly, the leader nodded. "Speak your terms, then. Let us see if this unity you propose is more than just words." Lyris's voice rang out, firm and precise. "No terms but recognition. We begin by acknowledging what has been lost, and we build from there." Maharis's voice followed, a counterpoint of warmth. "And we promise that this table, this conversation, is not the end but the beginning. One where your voices and stories matter as much as ours." For the next hours they spoke. Stories of forgotten worlds and broken promises filled the air, punctuated by moments of silence heavy with shared regret. Yet with each admission and each concession, the atmosphere began to shift. The warship's representatives spoke not just of what they had suffered, but of what they longed for, a place among the stars that did not cast them as enemies or relics but as equals. As the discussions deepened, the light outside the Citadel began to change. The cold darkness of space was interrupted by the warm glow of a distant sunrise, spilling across the glass dome above them, painting the chamber in gold and crimson. It was a sight Thomas would never forget. A new dawn, not just for the day but for an age where the future seemed not so daunting, not so far beyond reach. Hours later, when the last agreements were voiced and tentative alliances made, Thomas felt a weight lift from his heart. He looked at Lyris, whose proud bearing was softened by the realization of what they had accomplished, and then at Maharis, whose eyes shone with the joy of a battle won without bloodshed. This was the future, he thought. Not a choice between one queen or the other, not a dichotomy of strength or heart, but a tapestry woven with every thread. And as the delegates began to disperse, with the representatives from the warship lingering just long enough to share one last meaningful glance, Thomas felt a sense of certainty take root in him. The prophecy had spoken of one who would hold the balance, and he realized now that balance was not a solitary act. It was a shared endeavor, a delicate dance between opposing forces that, together, created harmony. As he stepped into the light of the new dawn, Thomas knew the galaxy would never be the same, and neither would he.